Okay, everyone, so we're just going to go through a quick look at my process for post-processing. I do want to kind of drive home the idea that post-processing is very specific to your individual style, what you want to achieve, and the means by which you get to what you want to achieve. So please keep in mind that this is not a follow what I do. This is just an example of one way you can kind of approach your post-processing. This is also not a tutorial about software. I'm going to go through two different photos. One I'm going to do in Lightroom Classic, which is, I guess at this point, my preferred post-processor. I do also quite like Capture One, but I was using their Capture One Express for Fuji, which they have discontinued. I will then also be going through Apple Photos, which is free for those of you who have a Mac. Next week, I'm going to try to use two different software. I'll also be using Photoshop next week a little bit for our portrait post-processing. But as far as this week goes, we're looking at Lightroom Classic and Apple Photos. So one paid subscription and one included with the cost of your Mac. I don't want to say free because it's not free, but it's included with the cost of your Apple product. So let's start by looking here at Lightroom. I've already loaded in a few photos. I'm just going to be working with this one. So we're not going to be going through any of the organization. We've already talked about that in a previous unit. So we're going to dive right into developing. Now, one thing to kind of keep in mind is that when they created the layout, they did keep in mind an order of events, if you will, process of ordering. So the top to bottom scroll down is actually quite logical, and it does work to kind of just start at the top and work your way down. One thing I will say is that the automatic profile import when you come in Lightroom is to jack up the sharpness. I'm not a fan of that, so you can turn that down right away, you can also change your import settings and negate that, make that so that doesn't happen. But the point here is that you can kind of start at the top and work your way down in a nice, easy way. I'm not going to go through and explain what everything does. My biggest advice is to play with the sliders and kind of understand from visualizing. So just practicing, playing, and figuring it out. I will say if there's something specific that you want to do, you want to learn, you can ask in the Discord, ask in the comments here, ask on Reddit, but also honestly just Googling what you're trying to do will give you a insane plethora of information, lots of YouTube videos, and so forth. So the first thing I usually do is white balance. I shoot with auto white balance in RAW. So the best thing to do is to then correct the white balance on import. The easiest thing for me is to grab the dabber, find a neutral zone, so a light white gray, and it will adjust it accordingly. Very, very subtle difference on this one. The auto white balance kind of nailed it. So you can kind of see, if you look carefully, the before is a little bit cooler. The after is a little bit warmer. You can see it most up here on this white space. So after white balance, this is when you kind of can address your exposure and contrast with the sliders. I tend to use the tone curve more, but these are a great way to kind of just any direct exposure issues that you want to hit. Maybe it's you purposely underexposed, maybe you didn't purposefully underexpose. You can go ahead and adjust that. I actually am kind of happy with where it was. And like I said, I tend to use the tone curve at the bottom. Same thing with contrast. If you want to add a little contrast, this is a perfectly reasonable way to do it. I do like to kind of play with the whites and blacks here a little bit because I like to have my photos be maybe a little bit extra bright. And one way I like to do that is with the whites. I really like those whites to be white, like You put on a Crest white strip on there and let it sit for way too long. But I'm actually quite happy with the way that this exposure is. Let me tell you kind of what I want to bring out in the photo. So there's a couple pieces of the photo that I think are the more interesting parts, and that would be this reflection, the driver, and the woman coming off the train. So those are the things that I kind of want to circle in on. And in order to do that, I'm going to play with the colors a little bit and then also the crop. Now, the question of when do you crop comes up a lot. And again, that's a personal preference. I tend to crop at the end because I like to visualize everything. I focus in a lot on color, and then I do the crop when I'm finished. Now, part of the reason I chose this photo is that reds are really tricky. And I do a lot of my post on my colors. So we're going to look at the red. I'm actually going to just jump past vibrance and saturation and into the tone curve. So one thing that you may have seen happen in trends and photos is this kind of crushed black, where the blacks are kind of washed out and gray. I honestly still like that. I know maybe it's a bit passé at this point, but I like that to some extent. I like to see a little bit of a fleshed out flat black as opposed to hyper contrasted black. So for me, one thing I like to do is I like to kind of pop a point in the middle, because the way that the tone curve works, let me just show you. This side are your shadows, this side are your highlights. Watch what happens if I just completely flip this line. You get an inverted version. So that's just to show you what sides of the tone curve do what. So if I wanted to affect the blacks, the shadows, I'm going to be working on this side of the tone curve. If I don't want the whites to be affected by that, I'm going to put a marker in the middle. And then when I move this, you see it doesn't really affect the whites. It does a little bit, but not to the point where it did before. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to just pull this up a little bit because I like a little bit of that black. And like I said, I really like my highlights to pop. So maybe I will pull a little bit over here as well. Again, this is very subtle so far. You see a little bit of the white balance shift in the greens here, and then you see a little bit in the blacks kind of flattening out. I do most of my work down here in the HSL sliders, hue, saturation, luminance. We will talk about these at length in our color theory week. So don't stress it too much at the point. Again, this is just an example of how I do my work. So I want to make sure those reds are the red that I see in my head when I think of those Prague trams. One thing you can do, you can go ahead and say, well, I want my reds to be super red. Now you have to be careful with the red because it will crush out and look awful really fast. You can go ahead and do that with these sliders. Okay, I want my oranges to be really orange, and so on and so forth. The other thing you can do, and this is a little, I think, more subtle, more nuanced, and a little bit more fun. If you grab this little dabber here, you can pick a color anywhere on here. And when you drag it up, see, it's bringing the red and the orange up because there's a little bit of red in here and there's a little bit of orange in here. Now, I do want you to notice as I do that, watch what happens to the woman coming off the train. What's happening to her face? She's getting like hyperpigmented, way too much self-tanner. So you do have to be careful with how you adjust, where you adjust. That's when things like masks come in. We're not going to spend a lot of time on masks right now. We will look at them a bit more in our portrait post-processing. But just know that if you want to do an adjustment to just one part, a mask will do it. We'll look at that at the end of this photo. So I want to maybe bring up the reds just a little bit, just blanket reds. I like my yellows as well to kind of fall more. I like my yellows to kind of fall more on the orange side of things. So I'm going to go ahead And the way to change the actual color tone is the hue. So I'm going to come in here and I'm just going to drag this a little bit to the orange. So it's less yellow and more orange. You can see the difference there a little bit. Hue, this is how the color looks, the tone of the color. How much of that color is the saturation. So if I want my yellows to be more yellow, more of it, that's the saturation. And then finally the luminance here. The luminance is the brightness that comes through the color. So watch what happens when I up the luminance on our reds. You see how it kind of pulls in more light behind the red, making it more bright, but also kind of losing some of the true tone of the color. If I go down, it does the opposite. Less light is coming through the red, making it a darker hue of red as well. It's important to know with these how that affects skin tone. People have reds, yellows in their skin. And when you play around with the luminance, it does affect how skin works. We're going to look at that in the portrait class a little bit more because I do use that quite a bit to recover some skin tone. Okay, so here we go. We have very subtle changes here. If I wanted to do a crazy change, I could go into my color grading. You have midtones, shadows, and highlights. Shadows are our shadows, highlights are our highlights, and midtones are everything in between. I can go ahead and I can actually put a color into the shadow there if I wanted to add maybe that famous teal and orange. I can do that right here. There you go. You kind of have that cross-process vintage vibe, I guess you can say. And you can also adjust how strong that is. Again, I'm not describing everything to a T. I'm just kind of showing you what the process might look like. Another way to adjust for that, if you want to play with the shadows and say you want the shadows to be on the blue end, you see in our tone curve we have these 3 different colors, blue, green, red, RGB. I can actually add some blue to the shadows right here in the tone curve. And look how extreme that can be. Okay, so you can actually do that in a couple different places, depending on what you're comfortable with. I'm kind of, I don't know if it's just out of habit, but I tend to kind of do that shadow work here in the tone curve versus down here. Although this reminds me more of video editing, which I have a background in, so this is kind of more true to that. So very little edit has happened here. Maybe this wasn't the best option for showing you. But again, I'm just trying to show you what it looks like when I do it. Now, I wanted to tell you, we talked in the beginning about how I wanted to bring up this reflection. A mask is going to help me to do that. So Lightroom has various masking options. None of them are really going to work here for me because there's no sky that I want to auto AI pull out. The subject is who knows, and it's not specifically the background. So I'm going to actually use a brush. You can change the size and the strength of the brush, the feathering, just by scrolling up or down. But I'm just going to brush in on the window. Okay, because I really want to bring up that portion. And you see now I have all these options for my brush. So if I want to make that brighter, you see the exposure can look a little messy really fast, right? So you do want to be careful what you are bringing up. I want to bring up the highlights. I want her to be a little bit crisper, and I want the shadows to still be there so there's still some contrast, but I can bring up everything just a little bit. When I do it like that, it really, you can tell that it's kind of been brushed in. But if take your time with it and you're more careful about your brushing, that helps. I also don't love the color temperature right now. It's a little on the green side. So I'm going to shift the color temperature as well so it matches more with the rest of the picture. So again, it's a little messy on the side here. If I decided I wanted to take it out, I can. I can hold down on Mac, I can hold down Option and just rebrush, which erases some of the brush. You know, so it's where it's a little messy, I can kind of clean it up. Okay, so my point here is that this portion of the screen, of the image, I wanted to emphasize, and then also the woman coming off of the train. There's a lot of highlights here where these women are, these girls. I can make a new brush. Let me just get rid of that. I can make a new brush. Brand new brush here, and I don't want them to be so bright. I feel like they're distractingly bright. It's the first thing I see. I can lower the highlights is the main problem because they have a lot of sun bursting off of their head. Okay, and I can also lower the shadows as well, just to kind of bring attention away from them and into where I want it. When I go into my crop, that may happen as well. I may see cropping them a little bit, but this is a good start. You see how different it is there. I can also kind of paint the stairs to kind of add some more darkness to kind of make the woman pop. Again, the more careful you are with this, the better it looks. When you're just trying to quickly go through, that's fine. It's a reasonable, quick edit to just make her pop a little bit more. Now, one other thing in here are reflections. I'm going to come out of my masks. I'm going to go back into just my regular edit settings. I feel pretty okay about my colors now. My yellows are where I want them. My reds could use a little bit of work. I like them to be a little bit deeper red. But you have to be very careful with red. Watch what happens when you play with red. You get these kind of hot spots. You see that? So you have to be very, very careful with red. Red is probably the most difficult color to adjust for. When you oversaturate it, undersaturate it, it's very apparent. So you just have to be a little bit careful. Okay, I feel better about those reds now. I want to kind of attack this reflection a little bit. So here's the noise reduction that we saw. Here's some lens corrections. All of this transform we're going to get to here. We can add grain if we want, if you want it to be more like that or like that, obviously. I'm just going to pop up maybe a little bit of grain. I don't mind the grain. Okay. If we come back up to the top, we have texture, clarity, and dehaze. I want to just point out dehaze a little bit here. You see, as you do dehaze, what happens to the reflections, it kind of gets filled in a little bit. Just be very careful with this, but it can be a useful tool when you're trying to eliminate and bring out some more of that color away from a reflection. All right, so let's say I'm happy with my colors, I'm happy with the general brushing and all of that. That's when I go then to my transform. So this image was shot from a second floor, third floor in America apartment. So it's at an interesting angle. I can't really, watch what happens if I try to adjust for it. It gets all goofy. So you can't really level this or flatten or vertically level it or anything like that. I'm actually fine with the angle at which it's shot, but I might want to lose some of the extra stuff in it. I do love a good foreground element, but I feel like this window isn't doing anything for me. So I'm going to come out, and I also feel like the roof isn't really doing anything for me. So I'm going to crop in a little bit. I don't want to lose the lights of the tram. I don't want to lose any of the red. So I'm going to go through, and then maybe I'll adjust it a little bit, straighten it out just a little bit by eye, as opposed to using the angle or the transform. And there we go. Still have a little bit of that foreground, but it's not bothering me. I do think the overall, I want to bring more attention to the woman, the driver, and the other woman. I think that hit the spot there. I would clean it up a little bit more with my brushing, and maybe adjust the greens and yellows a little bit more. But that's it. That's a basic edit for how I feel happy. Then I'm going to go ahead and export it. You can go to File, Export, or you can do Command-Shift-A. And I can make a subfolder and just say class test, like that. I can decide if I want to rename it. I just have it set to my initials. And then I can decide how big I want it. If I'm going to be dropping it on my website, for example, I usually do it at 2048. Resolution 70 is fine. If I'm printing it, it's going to be a higher resolution and so forth. Export, there it goes. That's it. That's actually a pretty slow version of how I would run through something like that. But there we go. That's Lightroom. Let's say that I did all of this and I have like another set of images that I took at the same time and I want to kind of just drop the same settings on them. I can easily copy the settings. You get to choose what you're drawing. I'm not going to copy the masks, for example, because those are specific to the space. But I can go ahead and I can copy them and I can paste them. Another thing I can do is I can actually make a preset based on the settings that I just did. And then I can come back to it and use it again. So there we go. Those are the adjustments I made on a completely different image. Not so bad, actually, despite being very different. Okay, let's look at photos. A basic process in Photos. So here's Photos. Here's that image we just saw. This is Apple Photos. Once upon a time, I was a huge fan of Aperture, which was Apple's answer to Lightroom. Even got certified in it and all that fun stuff, but they discontinued it 1,000 years ago. So here we are. We have Apple Photos. It's actually incredibly impressive for the amount of stuff you get in there. It's very capable. Curves, levels, all these things, selective color, all these things that you would expect to have in there, you have. They do tend to use these more generic terms like light, color, and so on. You'll see that as well in things like Snapseed and the other one I use, Visco. There we go, on my phone, Visco. But when you come and you open up the options, you get all the real deal stuff. So it can be a very simple one for those who don't want to get too deep into it, but then it also can be more advanced for those who feel like they have a good handle on it or just want to play around and see what happens. So I have this picture. I feel like the sky is kind of boring. I feel like the colors are kind of flat. It was a flat white day out, which is great for portrait, but maybe not so great for landscape. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to do a quick edit on this. Maybe just talk a little bit as I do it, but not as much as I did in the last one. So black point, there you go. That's the lifting the shadows, so forth, which I can do the same in my curves, but it's here as well. I feel like the exposure is fine. It's not too dark. It's not too light. It's actually pretty good. Okay, so I'm not really going to play with that. Maybe I'll bring the contrast up a little bit because it's such a flat image. My color, you'll notice saturation, vibrant, and cast. It's not as apparent, but here you go. Down here is where you can do the HSL sliders. So same thing, I can choose that red and adjust that red right there. So just like I was in Lightroom, same vernacular even, but there you go. Curves is the same thing. If I wanted to kind of do my flat shadows, I can do that. I can also, I didn't show you this in Lightroom, but there's something called an S curve, which as it sounds is like drawing an S. And that's a nice little trick to just make a hyper contrasted image there. So you can see the S curve. I'm trying to show you the original, but my trackpad is broken, so I can't hold down on it. But trust me, that is definitely more contrasted on there. White balance, I feel like the white balance is okay, but let's try it. Let's do a neutral gray, see what they do. Oh, fun. Okay. Maybe we want it a little warmer, maybe not, because it's a pretty wintry scene. It really doesn't want to adjust my white balance, so let's just ignore that for now, I guess. I can do auto white balance and let it do its thing. I don't like how gray it is. Let's add some saturation. That's so weird. Okay, guys, I'm gonna have to Let's go back into Lightroom for this one, I guess. I do want to just show you here. So you see, even in Apple Photos, you have the things that you have in Lightroom, just a little stripped down. Okay, let's go back to this image, I guess, over here. And actually, it might be fun to look at it in here because I have to reset it. Because the sky is so flat, so remember those masks and one of them was sky? It's going to pull that sky pretty easily. In Photoshop, that's even more intense. I can just pop in a new sky, but they actually, if you see here, so here's our mask. It pulled the sky out right away. I can go ahead and add some saturation to it. I can even shift the color if I wanted it to be like a fantasy, I guess, like orange sky, fantasy night. You have that option. Honestly, as long as you're not doing photojournalism, this is totally your game. You can do whatever you want. Feel no shame about dropping a different sky in there, especially if it's a sky that you took. By all means, go for it. Doesn't matter. All right, let's just go back and do a quick edit through. I'm not going to talk this time. You know, pretend I'm playing vaporwave music. I know I said I wasn't going to talk, but I just want to explain why I'm doing the things I'm doing. The thing I like about this picture is how cold it feels. So I'm kind of just playing to that a little bit. That said, I really like the yellows in these yellow lines that you cannot see. So I'm going to try to bring those up a little bit. And I do flip back and forth quite often, just so I can see myself, like what I've done in case I've gone too far. It's easier to see that when you flip back and forth, because definitely can go too far pretty easily. Trying to bring back some of the color into those lines. I feel like this red is a little too deep. Bring that up. And I'm actually going to bring the saturation down on it a little bit as well, because I do feel like it's too bright. If she were more prominent, if she were the only figure, then I would be okay with that. But I think because there are other figures and she's not really the star of the show, she's just kind of there, I don't want to bring too much attention to it. That said, I don't like the hue of it currently. I would prefer it to be more red like that without being overly in your face. Bring down the luminance. There we go. Happier with that. Okay. I think because I want it to seem quite cold, doesn't hurt to add some blues. And I think with the highlights, let's see. I don't usually listen to music or anything when I edit. I usually have on like a show I've seen 1,000 times. Like maybe I'll just be watching the OC in the background or something equally. I've seen it 1,000,000 times. It's kind of soothing. So you guys have to listen to me go, because I don't have either of those things right now. Okay, so I flattened it out quite a bit. You can see the color of the building has kind of become more yellow, which I'm not super thrilled about, but I can adjust for that later. It's much more white in person, and I think it makes sense to kind of keep it that way. But for the sake of showing you what we can and can't do, it's kind of become kind of like an aesthetic, Instagram aesthetic shot. Now here we go. This is going to be useful here. It doesn't hurt to try full out right away, because honestly it kind of kills it. It kind of does it every time. But if you have some strange angles, like for instance in this photo, it might not know what to do with it, and it might create some weird distortion. It does actually kind of work there, but that's not what it looks like in real life. So just keep that in mind, that it often works, but not always. All right. You can add a vignette. I think vignettes get a bad rap. I think they do a good job of bringing in your attention to where you need it to be, so long as you do it subtly. Like here you go, I've added a slight vignette. Can't necessarily tell that it's there. If I went like this, like, that's very like 1994 weddings photo, but a slight one is nice. And then also sometimes you'll find that the edges of your frames are maybe a little bit darker, so going the opposite route and giving a lighter vignette kind of evens that out. So don't get down on vignettes, friends. I think they're okay. You can add a little grain. That was very little. There we go. Okay, one thing, I feel like it's crooked. So I'm gonna come back up here and I'm gonna do a guided instead. With the guided, I can draw some lines to give it kind of an idea of where things should be. Not quite working with this one because of the angle. Doesn't quite work. Okay, so I'm gonna go back to full, but then, nope, didn't mean to do that. I'm gonna go back to full, and then I'm just gonna adjust for it with my eye manually. I trust my eye more than I trust stuff because I'm a boomer, I guess. Okay, that's slightly better. And you can test that and check it for real. But if you guys could see me right now, thank God you can't, because my head's at like a 45-degree angle trying to look at it, which is embarrassing. Okay, lovely. So let's go back here, and I just want to grab the sky again. See if we can get some life back into that, some color in. So it's not just white. Sorry, you have to listen to me snap my tongue. And you can even like drop a color like that, nice and easily. I don't want it to like be a bright blue day because it wasn't, and that feels wrong. I can even slide over. You see how I pulled that? Oh no. Okay. So I can go ahead and just even pull my slider over and grab from here if I wanted to, which has its application sometimes when it might be useful. Actually, right now, it's not so bad. Look at that. I don't hate that. There you go. That's not how I would 100% finish it, but there you go. Just a quick overview of how that might work. And again, I can go ahead and export it. Shift-Command-E, or go to the file, and we'll go into the same folder with the same settings as last time. All right, well, that is it. If you stuck around long enough, congratulations. Next week, we're going to go over portrait post-processing, which is going to be a bit more intensive. It's also going to include some Photoshop time. But again, this isn't like to show you specific software. This is just to show you what my process looks like. You read about Sean's process in the class. We have different processes. Everyone's going to have a different process. If you have specific questions about, well, I want to achieve this, or why did you do this, or so on, ask them. Myself or someone else is definitely going to come in and give you some guidance on that. All right. Thank you, everybody. And I look forward to seeing your befores and afters.